So let's start with some of the challenges to conventional economics. Many of us have argued that we needed to do what we call a greening of the national income accounts. Now, national income accounts are the most widely used system of indicator. We talk about economic growth. We're talking about usually GDP growth or GNP growth, and that's national income accounts. And yet it doesn't take into account the environment. In fact, it's even worse than that. A forest standing up counts for 0, and if you cut it down, it's considered a positive contribution to your national income. This is by the existing accounting definitions. So a number of people, including myself, were very active in lobbying the United Nations to change that. We did not succeed. At the time, I was the Vice President for Environmentally Sustainable Development at the World Bank. I was the first such post ever created. I created that Vice Presidency. And so we got what we call a set of satellite accounts. Now, the way this works is that we have conventional national income accounts, and we have satellite accounts, which we call environmental accounts. And what do we do in environmental accounts? We take account of the physical impacts, such as cutting down a forest, and that, of course, has a dose-response function. Here we're talking physical manifestations. And there is a likely impact on health and possible future production impacts. And then, so far, this is non-monetary. And then we usually try to put a dollar value on the health and production impacts. That's what we call economic evaluation. And then we get the impacts in monetary terms. Now, that's not all, because we started out, as I mentioned at the beginning, with resource depletion. How much are we taking away from nature? Whether it be oil out of the ground, it be forests being cut down, etc. But also environmental degradation by pollution, by loss of environmental services. So we add those two in there, and that gives us the environmental accounts. So what do we do next? Well, we confront those two accounts together, the conventional accounts and these accounts, and that's what we call green national income accounts. What is done, we have two kinds of green national income accounts. The first is just to take the net national product minus the resource depletion only, and the second one is the resource depletion and the environmental degradation. So that's the best we were able to get so far in terms of agreement of the various countries as to how to do their accounting. Of course, all of you, us living the current crisis, will know that it's not just the environmental accounts and the national income accounts that need to be revised. It is the entire system of regulation of credit and the money economy, and not just the real economy. But that's another issue which we'll get into. The key problem we have is this complexity of issues in dealing with the environment and growth, even when we try to bring them into the national income accounts, is that different environmental indicators change differently with rising income. Some actually improve, such as access to clean water, such as access to sanitation. Some deteriorate, such as amount of energy consumed per person. So what is the net balance of all of that? That is what we hope to do by having these various accounts brought together into a systemic way. Now, regretfully, the greening of national income accounts does very little for what we would refer to as the income per capita. It doesn't change all that much whether you take the first or second measure of environmental accounts. They're almost identical. But it changes dramatically when we go into the savings and investment side. And here's how it looks like. We did this study in '85, and that is looking at the percentage of GDP. This is the percent of GDP. And this is how much investment there is in Mexico. Now, initially, gross domestic investment looked a very healthy 22%. But then if you took out depreciation, it's down to 12%. If you took out depletion of natural resources, it's down to 5%. And then if you added the degradation of the environment, in fact, far from being a healthy 22%, it was a negative 2%. So we put a question mark here saying, we don't know, this is 1 year's case, or was it just Mexico, or what? Interestingly enough, of course, many of you know, this was at the period when there was a lot of American companies building near the border of Mexico, very polluting plants on the Mexican side of the border in the early '80s. So we moved and said, let's do it for all of Latin America, going from 1967 to 1991, so it's not a single year, but all of the countries of Latin America. And this is the curve we got, which is the equivalent of investment as a percent of GDP, and that's the curve we got. Then we started adjusting the curve as we suit the gross investment. We took out net foreign borrowing, we took out depreciation, we took out the asset sales, which is the loss of resources, and suddenly we got something which we call genuine saving, which my late friend David Pearce, very distinguished economist in the UK, was responsible for calculating these kinds of genuine savings curves. Now what's interesting here is that suddenly we do have negatives and positives emerging from this earlier curve. So the key thing is if we move from the conventional measure of economics, which is gross investment as a percent of GDP, to genuine savings, which is taking into account the environmental aspects, then we start seeing that in some cases we may have negatives and positives. Well, the key problem, which I consider an insurmountable challenge, and I've still posed it to many of my conventional economist friends, and they haven't been able to answer it, is that if you take a cut like that, you have 2 points that in conventional economic terms are identical. They are both around 18% of GDP. Both years look identical. In one case, you have a positive 7.5%. In the other, you have a negative 2.5%. So you're talking about a 10% difference, 10% of GDP difference in environmental terms, if the environmental terms are correct. So the question that arises, is this curve credible? Since that curve, the red one, is the conventionally accepted one, the one we are proposing as an alternative is the green one. How credible is the green one? So my colleagues and I at the World Bank at the time redid all those calculations for all the regions of the world. And here's what it looks like. This is the green one for Latin America and the Caribbean. And here we have Sub-Saharan Africa, and here we have South Asia, and here we have East Asia. Now what's interesting in this observation is that, in fact, as we look through the 80s, I think everybody will accept that this was the so-called lost decade for Africa, it was a very bad decade, and that East Asia was taking off. So this measurement is real. It's capturing something very real. It captured the decline of Sub-Saharan Africa, and it captured the launch of East Asia, which our own eyes, our own senses, and practically every other indicator maintains is correct. And if that is the case, then if the green curve is correct, then the conventional curve cannot be accepted, because it masks huge variations on what happens in the environment, and therefore we need to change the national income accounts. So to address that, we developed a new concept, which we call sustainability as opportunity. And this one is, of course, going to bring us to InWEnt. Not knowing that, but it brings us to InWEnt anyway. I did a series of work with my colleagues, published in all these various publications. But really what we did, we started with the Brundtland Commission's definition of sustainable development. Sustainable development is the development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Widely known, widely accepted, totally wrong. Well, we had to work with it like everybody, and therefore we said, well, if we do something here, we'll test it out on the economic side, ecological side, social side, but it's not really tied together. It's like getting 3 separate books and then binding them together. They're not really one book. There's no consistency check between them. We don't really know how it works. So we decided to change the definition, and sustainability as opportunity. Sustainability is giving future generations as many opportunities as, if not more than, we have had ourselves. Now this is very close to the Brundtland definition, except that it is measurable and operational. Now why did I say that the Brundtland definition was not measurable and operational? Well, because the word needs is easy to understand for somebody who's starving, but what does it mean when people already have 2 cars, 3 televisions, and 2 VCRs? What does it mean, the word need, meet their need? And yet it is that kind of family which is consuming 85% of the global output in the world today, actually more than 85%. counting rich families in poor countries as well as the industrial countries. And that's why we wanted something that was measurable and operational. Now, by that definition, I can redefine that. Opportunity is really the capital per person. Why is it capital per person? Well, if my son has more capital than I have had, he has a better opportunity of generating an income and services stream.